The email from my daughter Emma sat in my inbox for 3 hours before I found the courage to open it. Mom, we need to discuss your retirement accounts and investment portfolio. Jason and I want to make sure everything is properly managed. The subtle implication was clear. At 68, she thought I was no longer capable of handling my own finances. What she didn't know was that I'd been anticipating this conversation for months. The financial advisor at Oakridge Community Bank had warned me that my sudden withdrawal of substantial funds would eventually raise questions from my increasingly money-conscious daughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I closed my laptop and gazed out the window of my modest craftsman. Home, the one I'd maintained alone since Robert passed away 5 years ago. The Japanese maple he'd planted on our 25th anniversary blazed crimson against the October sky. He would have known exactly how to handle this situation. He always had the perfect balance of compassion and firmness with our daughter. I had to find that balance on my own now. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this journey. If you're enjoying these stories of family, wisdom, and unexpected twists, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in. I first noticed the change in Emma's behavior at Robert's funeral. While I was drowning in grief, she and Jason were unusually interested in the details of Robert's life insurance, our property deeds, and investment accounts. Just trying to help you organize, Mom, she'd said, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder while simultaneously eyeing the paperwork spread across my dining room table. I'd been a high school principal for 30 years before retirement. I recognized deflection tactics when I saw them. For most of her life, Emma had been compassionate and thoughtful. She'd chosen a career in healthcare administration, married Jason, a financial analyst with ambition that bordered on obsession, and settled into a life of calculated advancement. Their home in the upscale lakeside district of Oakridge boasted all the trappings of success: imported furniture, luxury vehicles, and a carefully curated social media presence that showcased their perfect life. What wasn't visible in those carefully filtered photos was the mounting debt they carried, the second mortgage they'd taken out to maintain appearances, or the fact that Jason's investment opportunities had consistently underperformed. I knew all this not because Emma had confided in me, she hadn't, but because Frank Collins, my late husband's best friend and financial advisor, had quietly kept me informed. "Martha, I don't mean to overstep," he'd told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings at Rosie's Cafe, but Jason approached me about becoming an investor in his new venture. When I asked for prospectus details, what he provided raised several red flags. I stirred my coffee thoughtfully. What kind of red flags? Frank's expression was troubled beneath his salt and pepper hair. The kind that make me think he's looking for quick cash injection rather than legitimate investors. And Martha, he hesitated, his voice dropping. He mentioned how your retirement accounts would be coming into play soon to fund expansion. The chill that ran through me wasn't from the cafe's aggressive air conditioning. My retirement funds represented decades of careful saving, sensible investments guided by Robert and Frank, and the security I'd planned for my later years. They were substantial, enough to support me comfortably and leave something meaningful. For Emma, eventually. But they were never intended to be Jason's venture capital. I responded to Emma's email with casual warmth, suggesting Sunday brunch at my home. "Looking forward to catching up. I've been meaning to discuss some financial matters with you, too." The last part wasn't a lie. I had indeed been contemplating how to protect what Robert and I had built, just not in the way Emma might be expecting. Sunday arrived with picture-perfect autumn weather. I spent the morning preparing Robert's famous sourdough waffles and brewing fresh coffee. At precisely 11 a.m., Emma's silver BMW pulled into my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched my daughter emerge, immaculately dressed in casual designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly expenses. Jason followed, checking his phone even as he closed the car door. "Mom, the house looks lovely," Emma said as she entered, eyes scanning the living room with what appeared to be appraisal rather than appreciation. "Have you considered updating the kitchen, though? Stainless appliances would increase the property value substantially." I embraced her, noting how she stiffened slightly before returning the hug. "The kitchen works perfectly for my needs, sweetheart. Besides, your father and I chose these appliances together." Jason glanced up from his phone long enough to give me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. "Martha, good to see you. Hope you're keeping well." His smile didn't reach his eyes, which were already surveying the dining room where I'd laid out brunch. Throughout the meal, conversation remained superficial. Their recent vacation to Bermuda, renovations to their home gym, an upcoming charity gala where Jason was being honored for his community contributions. I listened attentively, asked appropriate questions, and waited for them to reveal their true purpose. It came, predictably, with coffee and dessert. "So, Mom," Emma began, setting down her fork with surgical precision beside her barely touched apple tart, "Jason and I have been thinking about your situation." "My situation?" I echoed, my tone deliberately neutral. "Your retirement planning, estate management, long-term security," Jason interjected smoothly. "At your age, these matters require professional oversight. Emma and I are concerned that you might be overwhelmed." I sipped my coffee calmly. "That's thoughtful of you. What specifically has caused this concern?" Emma and Jason exchanged glances before my daughter continued. "Well, the bank statement that came to our house." "To your house?" I interrupted, feigning confusion. "Why would my bank statements go to your address?" Emma had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "I may have updated some of your contact information when I was helping organize paperwork after Dad died, for safekeeping." "I see," I said quietly, making a mental note to verify exactly what other updates she might have made without my knowledge. "Anyway," Jason continued, his tone shifting to what I recognized as his business voice, "we noticed some concerning transactions, large withdrawals, inconsistent activity. At your age, cognitive changes can affect financial decision-making without you even realizing it. My age." The phrase landed like a small stone. I was 68, not 98. I had administered a school budget of millions for decades. I held 2 master's degrees. Yet here was my son-in-law, barely 40, explaining cognitive decline to me as though I'd been found wandering the neighborhood in my bathrobe. "We've prepared some options," Emma said, reaching for her designer handbag and extracting a folder. "Jason has connections with an excellent financial management team. They specialize in retirement accounts and can ensure your assets are properly protected and growing. They can also simplify the eventual transfer process," Jason added, not quite meeting my eyes, "making things easier for everyone when the time comes." The time comes. A euphemism for my death, packaged neatly as administrative convenience. I accepted the folder with a smile that decades of parent-teacher conferences had perfected, pleasant but revealing nothing. "How considerate. I'll certainly review these materials." "Actually, Mom," Emma pressed, leaning forward, "we were hoping to get this initiated today. The team has openings this week for new clients, but they fill quickly. We brought the preliminary paperwork." She extracted another thicker folder from her bag. "Today?" I raised my eyebrows. That seems rather rushed for decisions involving my life savings. "It's not rushed when you consider how long these transitions take," Jason countered. "Realistically, Martha, the best time to have done this was 5 years ago. The second best time is now." I recognized the sales tactic immediately. Create urgency, emphasize scarcity, push for immediate commitment. I'd seen it countless times from textbook companies trying to sell overpriced materials to my school. Before we discuss paperwork, I said, standing to clear the plates, I'd like to share something with you both. I retrieved a photo album from the bookshelf, one I'd prepared specifically for this conversation. Opening to the first page, I pointed to a photograph of my parents standing in front of a small, dilapidated house. This is where I grew up, I explained. My father worked 2 jobs, factory days and security guard nights. My mother cleaned houses and took in sewing. They lived through the Depression, and it shaped everything about how they viewed money. I turned the page to a photo of myself in graduation regalia. They saved every penny so I could be the first in our family to attend college. They understood something fundamental about wealth. It's not just about accumulation, but about purpose. Emma shifted uncomfortably. That's a lovely sentiment, Mom. But what does this have to do with your retirement accounts? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Everything, I replied simply, turning to a photo of Robert and me on our wedding day. Your father and I built our financial security deliberately, guided by values, not just dollar signs. We saved for specific purposes: education, security, making a difference in ways that mattered to us. Jason's impatience was palpable. With all due respect, Martha, reminiscing doesn't address the immediate concerns about your asset management. I closed the album and met his gaze directly. Actually, Jason, it establishes context for the decisions I've already made. Emma's head snapped up. What decisions? I've restructured my financial portfolio over the past year, I said calmly. Working with Frank Collins and Susan Reynolds. You remember Susan, my attorney since before you were born. Restructured? How exactly? Jason's voice had taken on a sharp edge. I've established a carefully designed trust, consolidated investments, liquidated certain assets, and reallocated funds according to my priorities for this stage of my life. Emma's face had paled slightly. Without consulting us? Mom, that's exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making we're concerned about. I couldn't help but laugh, though without malice. Sweetheart, a process that took 14 months of consultation with financial and legal experts is hardly impulsive. And while I value your concern, I wasn't aware I needed my daughter's permission to manage my own assets. Of course you don't, Jason interjected, his tone softening to something almost patronizing. But family financial planning should be collaborative. We're only thinking about your long-term care and security. I studied his face, the calculated concern, the practiced sincerity. He was good. I had to give him that much. In another context, with someone less experienced in reading people, his performance would have been convincing. I appreciate that thought, I said, which is why I'd like to invite you both to meet with Frank and Susan next week to review the new arrangements. Complete transparency. You can ask any questions, express any concerns, and understand exactly how I've structured things. Relief washed over Emma's face. That sounds reasonable. We only want what's best for you, Mom. I know, dear, I replied, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Though I should mention one significant change right away, so you're prepared. What's that? Jason asked, his attention suddenly laser-focused. I've designated a substantial portion of my liquid assets to establish the Robert Wilson Memorial Scholarship Foundation at Oakridge Community College. It's already funded and operational. The first scholarships will be awarded next semester. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's mouth opened slightly, while Jason's expression cycled rapidly through shock, confusion, and what appeared to be calculation, likely trying to determine how much remained and whether this changed their prospects. That's a significant decision, Emma finally managed. Yes, I agreed. Your father was the first in his family to attend college, thanks to a small community scholarship. We always planned to pay that forward someday. After he passed, it seemed like the perfect way to honor his memory. How much? Jason asked bluntly, earning a sharp look from Emma. The foundation is endowed with $2 million, I stated, calmly. Structured to provide 10 full scholarships annually in perpetuity. Jason's face flushed dark red. $2 million, without discussing. Martha, with all due respect, that money was mine. I finished for him, my tone still pleasant but firm. Earned through decades of work, carefully saved and invested, by your father-in-law and me, and now allocated according to our shared values. Emma seemed to be struggling to maintain composure. Mom, while that's very generous, have you considered your own needs? Long-term care costs are astronomical now. What if you need assisted living or medical support? Comprehensive provisions have been made for my care, I assured her. Frank has detailed projections based on actuarial data, healthcare inflation, and my family medical history. I haven't been reckless, Emma. The afternoon continued with tense conversation, thinly veiled inquiries about remaining assets, and increasingly transparent attempts to ascertain exactly what financial resources might eventually come their way. I maintained polite boundaries, referring detailed questions to the upcoming meeting with my advisors. As they prepared to leave, Emma hung back while Jason loaded their designer grocery bag, containing the untouched remaining apple tart, into their car. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice lacking its earlier confidence, "are you upset with me? With us? I feel like this scholarship decision was somehow punitive." The vulnerability in her question momentarily revealed the daughter I remembered, the one who had once valued more than material success. I took her hands in mine. "This isn't punishment, Emma. It's purpose. Your father and I always believed that what we built should do meaningful good in the world. The foundation honors that belief." But she hesitated, glancing toward the BMW where Jason waited. "We had plans. Jason's business expansion, a vacation property we've been looking at on Lake Pinecrest. We thought with your retirement accounts that they would eventually fund those plans?" I finished gently. She had the grace to look embarrassed. "It sounds terrible when you put it that way." "It sounds honest," I corrected. "And honesty is where we need to start rebuilding." As I watched them drive away, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Sadness for the relationship that had become so transactional, determination to maintain boundaries, and hope that perhaps this reality check might eventually lead to reconnection around something more meaningful than money. Inside, I called Frank to confirm our meeting for the following week. "They took it about as expected," I told him, settling into my favorite armchair by the window. "The Scholarship Foundation revelation landed hard?" he asked, knowing me well, enough to anticipate my strategy. "Like a boulder," I confirmed. Though I'm more concerned about Emma than the money. Somewhere along the way, she lost sight of what really matters. "People can find their way back to their values, Martha," Frank reminded me gently. "Sometimes they just need a wake-up call." "That's what I'm counting on," I admitted. "The foundation isn't just about honoring Robert. It's about reminding our daughter who her parents really are and what we truly value." After hanging up, I opened my laptop and navigated to the secret project I'd been working on for months. Not the Scholarship Foundation. That was real and substantial. But something else entirely. Something Emma and Jason wouldn't discover until our meeting next week. Something that might just shatter their assumptions completely. The document on my screen was titled The Legacy Journal, a detailed chronicle I'd been compiling of family, history, values, and the true meaning of wealth as Robert and I had understood it. Alongside it were photographs, records, and evidence I'd gathered of Emma and Jason's increasingly concerning financial manipulations, the redirected bank statements, the attempted access to my accounts, the subtle gaslighting about my cognitive abilities. But it also contained something else. Something that would indeed cause Emma to freeze when she discovered what I was really leaving her. Not just the material inheritance she and Jason had been calculating, but a carefully structured path back to the values and perspective she'd lost along the way. As I added notes from today's revealing brunch conversation, I glanced at the Japanese maple outside my window, its crimson leaves catching the afternoon light. "You were right, Robert," I whispered to the empty room. "Sometimes the most valuable legacy isn't what we leave, but what we teach them to value." The days leading up to our meeting with Frank and Susan seemed to crawl by. Emma called twice, ostensibly to check on me, but her questions inevitably circled back to my finances and whether I'd given more thought to their management proposal. I maintained friendly but firm boundaries, redirecting the conversations toward genuine connection and reminiscing about happier family times. Wednesday evening, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Opening it revealed Jason standing alone on my porch, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled, his luxury sedan parked hastily in my driveway. "Jason," I greeted him, surprised. "Is everything all right? Where's Emma?" "Working late," he replied, his tone lacking its usual confident edge. "I was hoping we could talk privately, Martha. Just you and me." Something in his demeanor triggered my inner alarm system, honed through years of identifying troubled students before problems escalated. Nevertheless, I invited him in, deliberately choosing to sit in the living room rather than the more intimate kitchen setting. "What's on your mind?" I asked, declining to offer refreshments. This clearly wasn't a social visit. Jason leaned forward, elbows on knees, in what I recognized as his serious business posture from previous family discussions. I wanted to speak candidly about the financial situation, without Emma's emotional involvement complicating things. "I see," I replied neutrally. "What aspect specifically?" "The scholarship foundation," he said directly. "While admirable in theory, I'm concerned about the timing and magnitude of such a decision. $2 million is an extraordinary sum to remove from family circulation permanently." Family circulation. The phrasing was revealing. "The foundation fulfills a long-standing intention," I explained calmly. "Robert and I always planned to establish it. The timing simply aligned with my overall financial restructuring." Jason's expression hardened slightly. "With respect, Martha, intentions are fluid. Circumstances change. Emma is your only child, your only legacy." "My legacy extends beyond my daughter, Jason," I corrected gently, "as does my responsibility for the resources I've been fortunate enough to accumulate." He shifted tactics, his voice softening. "Emma hasn't said anything, but I know she's hurt. She interprets this as rejection, like you value strangers' education over her future security. The manipulation was skillful, using my love for my daughter as leverage. Had I been less prepared, it might have landed effectively." "Emma's future security has never been in jeopardy," I pointed out. "She's a healthcare administrator with an excellent salary. You're a financial analyst. You own a beautiful home. By any reasonable measure, you're already secure." "On the surface, perhaps," he conceded, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "But there's something you don't know. Something I haven't even told Emma because I've been trying to protect her from worry." "Here it comes," I thought. "My investment firm has experienced some challenges," Jason continued, his expression carefully crafted to convey reluctant vulnerability. "Market volatility, unexpected regulatory changes, nothing catastrophic, but significant enough that we've had to leverage more than is ideal. The expansion I've been planning would stabilize everything, but it requires capital I had hoped would come from family resources." "Your firm is in financial trouble," I translated plainly. His expression flickered with annoyance before resettling into contrived openness. "Not trouble, transition. With proper investment now, we could double returns within 18 months. That's why the timing of your decision is particularly challenging." I studied him carefully, noting the subtle tells that belied his composed exterior, the slight tension around his eyes, the too-perfect positioning of his hands, the carefully modulated tone. Jason wasn't just concerned about my financial decisions, he was desperate. "How much are you looking for exactly?" I asked directly. Relief washed over his face. He thought I was considering his implied request. "The ideal investment would be around $3 million. But I understand the foundation is already established. Perhaps there are other assets that could be reallocated temporarily." $3 million. The specific number confirmed what Frank had already discovered through his professional network. Jason's firm wasn't facing challenges or transition. It was on the verge of collapse due to a series of increasingly risky investments and misrepresentations to clients. "I appreciate your candor," I said finally, "and I understand your concern for Emma's well-being. That's something we share, albeit with different perspectives on what constitutes well-being." "Then you'll consider adjusting your plans?" Hope flared in his expression. "I'll honor our agreement to discuss everything transparently at Friday's meeting," I replied carefully, "with Emma present, along with Frank and Susan, so everyone has the same information simultaneously." Disappointment and frustration crossed his face before he could mask it. "Of course. I just thought a preliminary conversation might simplify things." As he rose to leave, I decided to offer one piece of genuine advice. "Jason, whatever financial challenges you're facing, and I suspect they're more serious than you've indicated, hiding them from Emma isn't protection. It's deception that undermines your partnership." His response was a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Martha. I'll see you Friday." After he left, I immediately called Frank to relay the conversation. "He's getting desperate," I concluded. "And he's still keeping Emma in the dark about how bad things really are." "The regulatory investigation is advancing," Frank confirmed grimly. My contact at the Securities Commission couldn't share specifics, but indicated we should be prepared for significant developments within the month. "Poor Emma," I sighed. Genuine concern for my daughter, overwhelming momentary satisfaction at having my suspicions confirmed. "She has no idea what's coming." "Are you reconsidering any aspects of your plan?" Frank asked carefully. I gazed at the family photographs lining my bookshelf. Emma's graduation, her wedding day, moments of genuine joy and achievement throughout. Her life before materialism and Jason's influence had reshaped her values. "No," I said finally. "If anything, this makes it more important. Emma needs the truth, all of it, before Jason's house of cards collapses completely." Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Oakridge. I dressed carefully in one of my more professional outfits, a navy blue suit I'd often worn for important school board meetings, and arrived at Frank's office 20 minutes early to review our strategy one final time. Susan Reynolds, my attorney for over 30 years, was already there, her silver hair pulled back in its characteristic elegant bun. "Are you ready for this, Martha?" she asked, her kind eyes reflecting understanding of how difficult this confrontation would be, despite its necessity. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, accepting the cup of tea Frank's assistant offered. "This isn't how I imagined my relationship with my daughter at this stage of life. Sometimes the most loving path isn't the easiest one," Susan observed, something she'd first told me decades ago when I was struggling with appropriate consequences for teenage Emma after a serious breach of trust. At precisely 10 a.m., Emma and Jason arrived. My daughter appeared tense, her smile tight as she greeted Frank and Susan with professional courtesy. Jason projected confidence, but the slight sheen of perspiration at his temples betrayed his underlying anxiety. "Thank you all for making time for this discussion," Frank began once we were settled in his comfortable conference room. "Martha has asked us to provide complete transparency regarding her financial restructuring and to address any questions or concerns you might have." "We appreciate that," Jason replied smoothly. Financial clarity is important for family harmony and proper planning. Frank nodded and proceeded to outline my overall financial position, the consolidated investments, the scholarship foundation's structure, and the provisions made for my long-term care. He deliberately omitted specific numbers initially, focusing instead on the strategic approach and underlying principles. As you can see, he concluded this overview, Martha's arrangements follow sound financial planning principles while honoring her and Robert's long-standing values and intentions. This all sounds very responsible, Emma acknowledged, her expression softening slightly. Though I'm still concerned about the scale of the scholarship foundation relative to overall assets. $2 million is substantial. It represents approximately 20% of your mother's total portfolio, Frank explained, well within reasonable philanthropic allocation for someone in her financial position. Jason leaned forward slightly. And the remaining assets? Are they primarily in retirement accounts, real estate, liquid investments? Here it was, the question they'd been building toward since arriving. Frank glanced at me, receiving my nod of permission before continuing. Martha's remaining assets are structured in a combination of vehicles. He distributed folders containing detailed breakdowns. As you'll see, there are provisions for continued philanthropy, personal needs and security, and yes, inheritance considerations. Emma and Jason opened their folders simultaneously. I watched their faces carefully as they processed the information. Emma's expression shifted from polite interest to confusion, then to shock. Jason's transformation was more dramatic, from eager anticipation to disbelief, then to barely contained anger. "This can't be right," he finally said, his voice tight. "These figures don't align with Martha's known assets and income history." "They're entirely accurate," Susan interjected calmly. "I've personally verified every transaction and holding." Emma looked up from the documents, her eyes finding mine with genuine bewilderment. "Mom, this shows most of your remaining assets are in irrevocable trusts with specific charitable designations, and a modest trust for long-term care. But there's almost nothing designated for inheritance." "That's correct," I confirmed gently. "But your retirement accounts," Jason insisted, flipping frantically through the pages. "Your investments, the equity in your home, the lake property. Where is everything?" "Exactly where I've chosen to allocate it," I replied evenly. "The retirement accounts fund my living expenses and the long-term care trust. The home will eventually go to Emma, of course. We sold the lake property 3 years ago to establish the initial charitable trust." 3 years ago? Emma echoed incredulously. "You never told me." "You never asked," I pointed out quietly. "Our conversations about my finances have been notably one-sided, Emma, focused on your access to my assets rather than genuine concern for my wishes." Jason was still processing the documents, his financial analyst mind, searching for some oversight or misunderstanding. "This is impossible. Your assets were substantial. You live modestly. The math doesn't add up unless you've been giving away money for years." Frank cleared his throat. "That's precisely what Martha has been doing, following a carefully structured philanthropic plan developed with Robert years ago and accelerated after his passing." Emma stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. "All these years, you've been systematically giving away your money? While we were counting on it for—" She stopped abruptly, realizing what she was revealing. "For what, Emma?" I asked gently. "What exactly were you counting on?" "My money for?" The conference room fell silent as my question hung in the air. Emma looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. Jason's jaw worked silently, calculations still running behind his eyes. "I think," Susan said into the silence, "this might be a good moment to address the second aspect of today's meeting." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew another set of folders, these marked with serious-looking legal tabs. "What's this?" Jason asked warily. "Evidence," Susan replied simply, her tone shifting from warm family friend to professional attorney. "Documented instances of attempted unauthorized access to Martha's accounts, forged signatures on financial documents, redirected communications from financial institutions, and most concerning, evidence of what appears to be a coordinated attempt to establish a case for diminished capacity in order to gain control of Martha's assets." The blood drained from Emma's face. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother has been aware of these activities for some time," Susan continued calmly. "Rather than immediately involving authorities, she chose to protect her assets while giving you an opportunity to reconsider this course of action." Jason's expression hardened. "These are absurd accusations. We've only ever acted out of concern for Martha's well-being." "Mom!" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes pleading with me. "You can't possibly believe we would." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "I have bank records, Emma. Security camera footage from my financial institutions, showing Jason using my stolen ID. Documented evidence of attempts to access accounts using my personal information. And recordings of Jason's conversations with various financial advisors, testing the waters about having me declared incompetent." Jason stood abruptly. "This is preposterous. We don't have to sit here and listen to these unfounded—" "Sit down, Jason," Frank said firmly. "Unless you'd prefer we continue this conversation with the Securities Commission investigators who are already looking into your firm's activities." That stopped him cold. He sank slowly back into his chair, his confident facade crumbling. Emma looked between us, confusion and horror dawning on her face. "Securities Commission? Jason, what is he talking about?" And there it was, the moment I'd been dreading and knowing was necessary. The complete unraveling of the deceptions that had been poisoning our family relationships for years. "Your husband's investment firm is under investigation for multiple securities violations," Frank explained gently to my daughter. "Client funds mismanagement, misrepresentation of returns, potentially fraudulent statements. The situation is serious, Emma. That's why you needed my retirement funds," I said quietly to Jason. "Not for expansion, for survival, to cover losses, before they were discovered." Emma turned to her husband, tears welling in her eyes. "Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't been lying to me about everything." Jason's silence was his answer. What followed was one of the most painful hours of my life, watching my daughter's world collapse as layer after layer of deception was exposed. Jason's financial manipulations, the true state of their own finances, leveraged to maintain appearances, the calculated attempts to gain control of my assets before the regulatory investigation closed in. Through it all, I maintained my composure, allowing Susan and Frank to present the evidence methodically while I focused on Emma, my child, who had been both complicit and victim in this scenario. When the initial shock had settled into a heavy, oppressive silence, I finally spoke directly to my daughter. "Emma, this isn't how I wanted things between us. Every decision I've made, including the decision to give rather than hoard wealth, comes from values your father and I tried to instill. Throughout your childhood, somewhere along the way, you lost sight of those values. So this is punishment," she said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Taking away our inheritance because we disappointed you." "No," I corrected gently. "This is consequence and protection, both of the resources I'm responsible for and, ultimately, of you." "Protection?" she repeated incredulously. "By leaving me nothing?" "By leaving you what matters most," I countered, nodding to Susan, who produced one final document, a slim leather journal I'd handcrafted over the past year. "This is your true inheritance, Emma," I said, sliding it across the table. "Not money that would disappear into Jason's schemes or fund an unsustainable lifestyle. This is the wisdom your father and I accumulated throughout our lives. The true meaning of wealth as we understood it. And yes, a path back to the values you once embraced before materialism and status became your measure of success. Emma stared at the journal without touching it, as though it might burn her fingers. There's one more thing you should know, I continued softly. While most of my financial assets are indeed allocated to charitable purposes, I've established a special trust that activates under specific conditions. What conditions? Jason asked sharply, momentarily forgetting his precarious position. Authentic reconnection with the values that truly matter, I replied, looking only at my daughter. The trust provides matching funds for any meaningful work Emma does to help others, educational support, community development, or other efforts that create genuine positive change. For every hour she invests, for every dollar she contributes from her own earnings, the trust will multiply the impact. Emma finally met my eyes, confusion evident. You're saying there is an inheritance, but I have to earn it through charity work? I'm saying the inheritance exists to amplify good you choose to do in the world, I clarified. Not to fund consumption or status symbols or risky investments. It's designed to reconnect you with the joy of making a difference, something you understood beautifully before. Before me, Jason finished bitterly. Before I corrupted your perfect daughter with materialism. Before you both lost perspective, I corrected firmly. This isn't about blame, Jason. It's about recovery and realignment. The meeting concluded shortly after, with Jason leaving abruptly while Emma remained behind, shell-shocked and silent. Susan and Frank tactfully withdrew to give us privacy. What happens now? Emma finally asked, her voice small and vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child facing consequences for a serious mistake. I moved to sit beside her, taking her hand in mine. That depends on choices you make going forward. About your marriage, about your priorities, about reconnecting with what truly matters. I don't even know what matters anymore, she admitted, fresh tears spilling. Everything I thought we were building, it was all an illusion. Not everything, I assured her. Your capabilities are real. Your potential to do meaningful work is real. The love between us, despite everything, is very real. She glanced at the journal still sitting untouched on the conference table. And this is supposed to guide me? It's a beginning, I said. A way back to the Emma I know is still there beneath the designer clothes and calculated ambitions. My daughter picked up the journal finally, running her fingers over its leather cover embossed simply with her name. I froze when I saw what you actually left me, she said quietly. It was the last thing I expected. Sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in dollars, I replied, quoting words Robert had often shared with her during her childhood. Emma nodded slowly, a glimmer of recognition in her eyes, not just of the saying, but perhaps of the truth behind it. Dad always said that, didn't he? It feels like I'm meeting you for the first time all over again, Emma said, softly as we sat across from each other at Rosie's Cafe 3 days after the devastating meeting at Frank's office. She cradled her cappuccino with both hands, her wedding ring conspicuously absent. The journal I'd given her sat on the table between us, its pages already showing signs of having been read multiple times. I stirred my tea thoughtfully. In some ways, perhaps we are. The masks have come off. The cafe buzzed with mid-morning energy around us. Retired couples enjoying late breakfasts, remote workers hunched over laptops, young mothers with strollers gathered by the windows. Ordinary people living ordinary lives while my daughter's world continued to fracture and reshape itself in painful ways. I've left Jason, Emma announced without preamble. At least temporarily. I'm staying at Caroline's guest house. Caroline was Emma's college roommate. one of the few friendships she'd maintained despite Jason's tendency to dismiss people who couldn't advance their social or financial position. I nodded, careful to keep my expression neutral rather than revealing my relief. I think that's wise. You need space to process everything. Process? Emma repeated with a hollow laugh. That's a gentle way of describing it. My husband is facing potential criminal charges. Our finances are in shambles once I started looking beyond the surface. And my mother... She paused, meeting my eyes directly. My mother has been 10 steps ahead of us, watching as we dug ourselves deeper into a hole of greed and dishonesty. Not watching with satisfaction, I clarified gently. Watching with heartbreak, trying to figure out how to help without enabling destructive patterns. Emma glanced down at the journal. You documented everything. For how long? The concerning patterns began about 4 years ago, I admitted. Small things at first. Comments about my outdated financial habits, suggestions that I wasn't keeping proper track of investments, subtle undermining of my cognitive abilities in conversations with others. I remember telling people you were getting forgetful about bills and accounts, Emma acknowledged, shame coloring her cheeks. Jason suggested it would help build a case for financial guardianship if necessary. The candid admission hung between us, remarkable in its honesty after years of calculated manipulation. When did you first realize what we were doing? She asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. The pivotal moment came when my bank notified me about unusual access attempts to my retirement accounts. Someone had my social security number, my mother's maiden name, and other security information, but couldn't provide the in-person verification. Jason, Emma whispered. I nodded. That's when I contacted Frank and Susan to help me understand exactly what was happening, and to protect myself while I figured out how to protect you. Protect me? Emma looked genuinely confused. I was part of this. You were influenced by someone who had become very skilled at manipulation, I countered. The Emma I raised, the daughter who spent college summers building homes with Habitat for Humanity, who taught literacy classes at the community center, that person wouldn't have calculated how to separate an aging parent from their life savings. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. I don't even recognize that version of myself anymore. Somewhere along the way, it became all about the next accomplishment, the next acquisition, the next rung on some imaginary ladder of success. The raw vulnerability in her voice reminded me of her teenage years, when feelings were intense and every setback seemed catastrophic. Despite everything, maternal instinct urged me to comfort her, to smooth away her pain. But wisdom born from decades of parenting reminded me that growth rarely comes without discomfort. Tell me about what you've been reading, I said instead, nodding toward the journal. Emma ran her fingers over the leather cover, tracing the embossed letters of her name. It's extraordinary. Family history I never knew. Lessons from Grandma and Grandpa that I'd forgotten. Dad's philosophy about money being a tool, not a treasure. She looked up at me. And documentation of my transformation from someone with purpose to someone consumed by appearances. That part was the hardest to write, I admitted. Watching, you drift from your core values year by year. There's a timeline, Emma continued. Side-by-side entries showing decisions Dad and you made about money alongside my choices during the same periods. The contrast is devastating. I reached across the table to touch her hand. It wasn't meant to shame you, Emma. It was meant to remind you of who you really are beneath the layers of influence and misplaced priorities. It's working, she said with a shaky smile, along with the spectacular implosion of my marriage and financial security. The waitress approached with fresh tea for me and a refill for Emma's cappuccino. We paused our conversation, both aware of the intensely personal nature of what we were discussing. When she departed, Emma leaned forward, her voice lower. I met with a financial advisor yesterday, she said. One that Frank recommended, not connected to Jason. The picture isn't pretty. Do you want to tell me about it? I asked carefully. Emma took a deep breath. The house is underwater. We refinanced twice to maintain our lifestyle as Jason's legitimate income decreased. The cars are leased at rates we can't actually afford. My retirement account has been systematically drained over the past 3 years. Apparently, I signed paperwork authorizing Jason to make emergency withdrawals during what he described as temporary cash flow situations. I kept my expression neutral, though inwardly I wasn't surprised. Frank's discreet inquiries had suggested similar findings. What about your income? You're still employed at Glenwood Health Systems, correct? Emma nodded. My salary is substantial. I've just never lived within it. And there will be legal expenses now, regardless of whether I stay with Jason or not. Have you decided about that? I asked, keeping my tone free of judgment. She stared into her coffee for a long moment. He's still my husband. We've been together for 12 years, but right now I don't even know who he really is, or who I've become when I'm with him. The complexity of her situation hung between us. Despite everything Jason had done, untangling over a decade of shared life wouldn't be simple or straightforward. One day at a time, I suggested gently. Give yourself permission to focus on immediate next steps without deciding the entire future today. Emma managed a weak smile. That's what Caroline said too. She's a wise friend. I'm glad you've reconnected with her. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the ambient noise of the cafe providing a comforting backdrop to our thoughts. Eventually, Emma spoke again, her voice stronger than before. I want to understand more about this trust you've created, the one that matches efforts I make toward meaningful work. How does it actually function? I smiled, encouraged by her interest. It's quite straightforward. The trust holds approximately $3 million. $3 million? Emma interrupted, her eyes widening. But the paperwork at Frank's office showed almost everything allocated to charitable causes. The majority is, I confirmed, but this portion is specifically designated to amplify positive impact you choose to create. For every documented hour you volunteer for approved community organizations, the trust contributes $100 to that cause. And if I donate personally? The trust matches your contributions at a 5-to-1 ratio, up to certain annual limits. Emma sat back, processing this information. So, instead of leaving me an inheritance to spend however I want, I've created a mechanism that honors meaningful choices you make to help others, I finished. The wealth doesn't flow directly to you, but your actions determine how it's distributed to causes that matter. That's ingenious, actually, Emma admitted, reconnecting financial resources with purpose and values. Exactly what your father and I always tried to teach you, I said softly. Money is meaningful primarily in terms of what it enables, not what it provides for oneself, but what impact it creates for others. Emma's phone chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at it and grimaced slightly. Jason's attorney. Again. Do you need to respond now? She decisively turned the phone face down on the table. No. This time with you is more important. The simple statement warmed me more than she could possibly know. For years, our interactions had been increasingly superficial, performance-based conversations where we shared sanitized highlights rather than authentic connection. This felt like the first real conversation we'd had in a very long time. I've been thinking about what you said, Emma continued, about the version of me that used to exist, the one who taught literacy classes and built houses. I contacted the community center yesterday. Hope flickered in my chest. What did they say? They're desperate for help with their adult education program. Budget cuts, staffing shortages. They lost their program coordinator last month and haven't found a replacement. Are you considering applying? I asked carefully, trying not to sound too eager. Emma tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture from childhood that emerged. When she was nervous or considering something important, it would mean a significant pay cut from my current position, and it's completely different from healthcare administration. But when I was describing the position to Caroline, I realized I was smiling. Actually smiling, not the polished, professional smile I've perfected for networking events, but a real one. She shrugged slightly. That seems significant somehow. It does, I agreed, containing my excitement behind a measured response. Have you scheduled an interview? Next Tuesday. Emma took a deep breath. Which brings me to another question. The guest house is lovely, but not meant for long-term stay. I need to find more permanent housing, especially if I'm making a career change with lower income. I understood immediately what she wasn't quite asking. Your old room is exactly as you left it. Well, I may have upgraded the mattress and linens, but otherwise unchanged. Relief washed over her face. Are you sure? After everything that's happened? Emma, I said gently, you're my daughter. Not just when things are going well or when you're making choices I agree with. Always. Tears spilled onto her cheeks. I don't deserve that kind of unconditional love after how I've behaved. That's precisely what makes it unconditional, I replied simply. It doesn't depend on deserving. 2 days later, Emma moved into her childhood bedroom, bringing surprisingly few possessions from the luxury home she'd shared with Jason. Most of it never really felt like mine anyway, she explained as she hung a modest selection of clothes in her old closet. Designer labels Jason insisted were appropriate for my professional image. Furniture chosen by an interior decorator he hired to create the right statement for entertaining. I observed but didn't comment as she unpacked, noticing she had brought the photos from her college years, pictures with friends on service trips, graduation with her public health minor professors, her first apartment decorated with secondhand furniture and homemade art. None of the formal portraits or professionally staged holiday images from recent years made the cut. That evening, we prepared dinner together, something we hadn't done since before her marriage. As Emma chopped vegetables for a salad, she asked about the scholarship foundation I'd established. How many students will it help each year? 10. Full scholarships, I explained, stirring the pasta sauce. Primarily for students who are first in their families to attend college, like your father was. Do you participate in selecting recipients? I chair the selection committee, I confirmed, along with 2 faculty members and the college's financial aid director. Emma considered this as she sliced cucumbers with surprising precision. The trust documentation mentioned I could eventually assume a role on foundation committees if I demonstrated commitment to its values. I glanced at her, careful to keep my expression neutral despite my surprise at her interest. That's correct. After a 2-year period of consistent community engagement, you become eligible for committee participation. I'd like to work toward that, she said quietly. Not just because of the money, but because it honors Dad, and because it matters. I nodded, allowing a small smile. I think that's a wonderful goal. Later that evening, as we sat in the living room with cups of herbal tea, Emma raised a more difficult topic. The journal mentions other victims, women Jason apparently targeted before me. Have they been notified about the investigation? I set my cup down carefully. Susan has been in contact with federal investigators about that very issue. From what we've been able to piece together, there were at least 2 women before you, both successful professionals with significant assets or inheritance prospects. Like me, Emma murmured. Similar profiles, I acknowledged. Each relationship lasted approximately 3 years before ending when financial irregularities were discovered. In both cases, the women suffered significant losses but didn't pursue criminal charges, likely due to embarrassment or Jason's manipulation making them doubt themselves. Emma stared into the distance, processing this information. He had it all planned from the beginning, didn't he? I wasn't special. I was a target. The pain in her voice broke my heart. You were targeted because of your success and prospects, yes. But the relationship evolved into something more complex than a simple con. What do you mean? I chose my words carefully. Based on communications we've uncovered and patterns we've observed, Jason became genuinely attached to you in his way. That doesn't excuse his actions, but it did cause him to deviate from his usual timeline. He stayed longer, became more entangled in your life than with previous targets. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Emma asked, a hint of her old sharpness returning. That he liked me enough to steal from me more slowly? Not better, I clarified. Just more complete understanding. Humans are rarely one-dimensional villains, even when their actions are clearly wrong. Emma was quiet for a long moment, absently running her finger around the rim of her teacup. I keep wondering how I missed the signs. I'm not naive or unintelligent. How did I let myself be manipulated so completely? Jason is extremely skilled at what he does, I reminded her. And we're all vulnerable to certain types of influence, especially when they align with desires or insecurities we already possess. What does that mean? I took a deep breath, knowing we were approaching sensitive territory. You always valued achievement, Emma. From the time you were small, you took tremendous satisfaction in accomplishments, recognition, external validation. Those aren't inherently negative traits. They helped you excel academically and professionally. But they made me susceptible, she finished, understanding dawning in her expression. Jason recognized and exploited that aspect of your personality, I confirmed gently. He positioned himself as someone who could help you achieve more, be seen as more successful, gain more recognition, while systematically redirecting my assets and isolating me from people who might question our lifestyle, Emma added bitterly. That's the pattern, yes. Emma set her cup down with a decisive click against the saucer. I want to meet them. Meet who? The other women Jason targeted. I want to understand their experiences, how they've recovered, what they wish they'd known. I considered her request carefully. That might be possible with appropriate privacy protections and their consent. I'll speak with Susan about arranging something. Thank you. Emma hesitated, then added, not just for that, for everything, for seeing what was happening even when I couldn't, for creating consequences without destroying me in the process. That's what mothers do, I said simply. We protect, even when it's complicated and messy. The following week brought significant developments. Emma interviewed for the community center position and was offered the role of education programs director, a job that would utilize her administrative skills while reconnecting her with direct service work. The salary was indeed substantially lower than her healthcare position, but as she explained, the guest apartment above the center comes with the job. It's small, but perfect for one person, and it means I can be completely independent while rebuilding my finances. I supported her decision wholeheartedly, recognizing the courage it took to make such a significant life change amid personal turmoil. Meanwhile, Jason's legal situation deteriorated rapidly as the Securities Commission investigation progressed from administrative inquiry to criminal referral. Emma received this news with complicated emotions: grief for what might have been, anger at his deception, and surprising relief that the truth was finally emerging. The prosecutor contacted me, she told me one evening as we walked through the neighborhood, enjoying the crisp autumn air. They want me to provide evidence about Jason's financial activities, including his attempts to access your accounts. How do you feel about that? I asked carefully. Emma was quiet for several steps, consideration evident in her expression. Conflicted. He's still my husband, technically. But what he did, What we did was wrong. Cooperating feels like the right thing to do, even though it's painful. Sometimes the right path and the easy path aren't the same, I observed. She nodded, kicking absently at a pile of fallen leaves. I've been thinking a lot about something in your journal. That entry about the difference between happiness and meaning. I remembered the passage clearly. Your father's philosophy. Dad wrote that pursuing happiness directly often leads to emptiness, while pursuing meaning creates a foundation for genuine joy. Emma recited from memory. That the good life isn't about accumulating pleasant experiences, but about contributing to something larger than yourself. He lived by that belief, I confirmed, even when it meant making choices that others didn't understand. Like when he turned down the principal position at Westlake Academy, Emma recalled. Everyone thought he was crazy to reject the prestigious private school for a struggling public one. He knew where he could make the most meaningful difference, I agreed, not where he'd receive the most recognition or compensation. Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm meeting with divorce attorneys tomorrow. 3 consultations to find someone who understands the complexity of the situation. Though I'd anticipated this development, hearing her say it directly still carried emotional weight. That's a significant step. It's necessary, she replied with newfound clarity. Whatever genuine feelings might have existed between us, the foundation was built on deception. I can't move forward without making a clean break. I nodded, my understanding, respecting her decision while recognizing the pain it entailed. Susan recommended someone who specializes in cases involving financial impropriety, Emma continued. She said I should be prepared for it to get complicated given Jason's legal troubles. You don't have to manage this alone, I reminded her, gently. She stopped walking and turned to face me directly. I know. That's what I'm finally understanding. For years, I've been trying to project perfect competence, handling everything independently, never showing vulnerability or need. It became exhausting. Community isn't a fallback for weakness, I said. It's the natural state of healthy human functioning. Emma smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes in a way I hadn't seen in years. Another wisdom gem from the journal? Native wisdom from countless generations, I corrected. Something our individualistic culture has largely forgotten. We continued walking as twilight deepened around us, the neighborhood streetlights flickering on one by one. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace, a comforting aroma that had always signaled home and safety to me. The investigators found evidence that Jason may have been working with others, Emma said after a while. Apparently, he had partners who helped identify potential targets and facilitate access to financial information. This was new, information that even Frank hadn't shared with me yet. A coordinated operation? Emma nodded grimly. The prosecutor called it a romance-based financial fraud ring. They've identified at least 7 other women besides the 3 we knew about, spanning nearly a decade. My heart sank, thinking about the multiple lives disrupted by this calculated predation. I'm so sorry, Emma. They want me to consider making a victim impact statement when the case goes to court, she continued. Not just about financial losses, but the psychological and emotional aspects of this kind of betrayal. How do you feel about doing that? Emma considered for a moment, scared, exposed, but also responsible somehow. If my experience could help others recognize warning signs or recover more effectively, that would transform your pain into something meaningful, I observed. Exactly. She glanced at me with newfound understanding. Like what you did with the Scholarship Foundation after Dad died, channeling grief into purpose. We had completed a loop around the neighborhood and were approaching our driveway again. The porch light I'd left on cast a welcoming glow, reminding me of countless evenings waiting for Emma to return from school activities, or later, college visits home. I've been thinking about something else, Emma said as we paused at the foot of the driveway. The trust you established, the one that matches community contributions. I'd like to start activating it. Hope flickered in my chest. You would? She nodded, suddenly looking younger and more earnest than she had in years. The community center needs updated technology for the adult education program. The director mentioned they've been trying to raise funds for new computers for over a year. That sounds like an excellent first project, I encouraged. Have they developed a formal proposal? It's in progress, Emma confirmed. I've offered to help finalize it based on my grant writing experience from healthcare. The porch light highlighted the animation in her expression as she described the technical specifications, potential community impact, and sustainability plan for the technology center. Watching her natural enthusiasm emerge after years of careful, professional polish, I glimpsed the daughter I'd known before materialism and status-seeking had reshaped her priorities. Inside, as we prepared for bed, Emma paused at the door to her childhood bedroom. I found something while unpacking yesterday, she said, disappearing briefly before returning with a faded construction paper creation, a Mother's Day card she'd made in elementary school. She handed it to me somewhat shyly. Remember this? I opened the carefully preserved card, smiling at the wobbly handwriting of 10-year-old Emma. To Mom, who teaches me what really matters. Love you, infinity times infinity. I remember exactly when you made this, I said softly. It was the year we skipped the expensive vacation to use the money for the community playground project instead. Emma nodded. I was disappointed at first about missing Disney World, but then I got to help design the playground equipment, and when it was finished, seeing all those kids enjoying something we helped create. She shrugged. It felt better than any vacation. You understood. Meaningful impact even then, I observed. And then I forgot, she said quietly, or got distracted by shinier, emptier things. I held up the card. But the foundation was always there, Emma. Values once deeply rooted may get covered up for a while, but they don't disappear entirely. She smiled, a mixture of sadness and hope in her expression. That's what I'm counting on. The next morning, Emma left early for her final day at Glenwood Health Systems. She would start at the community center the following Monday, beginning a significant transition in both her professional and personal life. I spent the morning in my home office, reviewing scholarship applications for the Foundation's first selection cycle, moved by the stories of determination and resilience from students hoping to transform their futures through education. Around noon, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I answered, I found myself face to face with Jason, the first time I'd seen him since the confrontational meeting at Frank's office nearly 2 weeks earlier. He looked markedly different, his usually impeccable appearance now showing signs of strain. The designer suit had been replaced by business casual attire that seemed slightly rumpled, and his confident posture had given way to a tenseness that suggested constant anxiety. Martha, he began, his tone deliberately modulated to project reasonableness. I apologize for coming unannounced. I've been trying to reach Emma, but she's blocked my calls. I maintained a neutral expression. Emma isn't home, Jason, and if she's chosen not to communicate with you directly, I need to respect that boundary. He shifted slightly, glancing past me into the house. I understand she's staying here now. Has she mentioned our situation to you? Jason, I said firmly, I'm not going to act as an intermediary. Any messages for Emma should go through the attorneys she's engaged. His carefully constructed reasonableness slipped momentarily, frustration flashing across his features before he recalibrated. I just want to explain some things to her. The situation isn't as black and white as it might appear. I believe the Securities Commission and federal prosecutors have a different perspective on that, I replied evenly. Jason's expression hardened slightly. You've never approved of me, have you, Martha? From the beginning, you've been looking for reasons to undermine our relationship. The accusation might have landed effectively in the past, triggering my desire to be seen as a supportive, non-interfering mother. But recent events had clarified so much about our dynamic that his attempt at manipulation seemed almost transparent. "What I've never approved of," I said calmly, "is deception and exploitation, particularly when directed at my daughter." He had the grace to look momentarily discomfited before shifting tactics again. "I made mistakes, certainly. Bad investment decisions, poor judgment in some financial matters, but my feelings for Emma have always been genuine." "I believe you think that's true," I acknowledged, surprising him with my response. "But genuine feelings don't justify harmful actions, Jason." He stared at me for a moment, seemingly recalculating his approach. "The investigators have frozen most of my assets," he finally said, his voice lower. "My accounts, investments, even access to my office. They're treating me like a criminal before anything's been proven." "I'm sorry you're experiencing consequences," I replied without sarcasm. "That must be extremely difficult." The sincere response seemed to throw him off balance. He'd clearly come prepared for hostility, or perhaps manipulation, not composed. Empathy that acknowledged his struggle without accepting his narrative. "I need to speak with Emma," he insisted, a hint of desperation entering his voice. "There are financial matters that require her immediate attention. Joint accounts, tax implications, property considerations. All of which should be handled through legal representatives given the circumstances," I reminded him gently but firmly. Jason's composed facade crumbled further. "They're painting me as some kind of calculated predator, Martha. A con man who targeted wealthy women. That's not who I am." I studied him, seeing beyond both the polished professional he'd presented during his relationship with Emma and the desperate man standing on my porch now. "Who are you then, Jason? Beyond the image you've cultivated?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a brief moment, vulnerability and genuine confusion crossed his features, as though he'd spent so long performing various versions of himself that the authentic core had become obscured even to him. Before he could respond, a car pulled into the driveway. Emma had returned home unexpectedly early, her expression freezing when she recognized Jason's vehicle at the curb. "I should go," I said quietly, preparing to step back inside to give them privacy. "No," Emma said firmly, approaching with measured steps. "Please stay, Mom." She turned to Jason, her voice calm but resolute. "Whatever you came to say needs to go through my attorney now. I've made that clear." "Emma, please," Jason began, the practiced charm entering his voice again. "Just give me 5 minutes to explain. What we built together over 12 years can't just be dismissed because of some financial irregularities." "Financial irregularities," Emma repeated, incredulity edging her tone. "Is that what you call systematic fraud, identity theft, and attempting to have my mother declared incompetent to access her assets?" Jason flinched slightly but recovered quickly. "Things got complicated. I made poor choices under pressure, but my feelings for you have always been real." Emma's expression softened fractionally, not with forgiveness but with something like pity. "I believe you think that's true, Jason, but real love doesn't exploit vulnerabilities or undermine someone's financial security." I recognized my own words from moments earlier, touched that they had resonated enough for Emma to echo them. "The prosecutors are building a case with incomplete information," Jason persisted. "They don't understand the context, the external pressures from investors, the temporary nature of the financial maneuvers." "The context," Emma said quietly, "is that you've been doing this for nearly a decade, Jason. With multiple women before me. It's a pattern, not an aberration." Shock registered on his face. Clearly, he hadn't realized how much information had been uncovered about his previous relationships. "I've provided the investigators with everything I know," Emma continued, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional toll. including documentation of attempts to access my mother's accounts and discussions about having her declared incompetent. Jason paled visibly. Emma, you don't understand what you're doing. If this goes to trial— It should go to trial, she interrupted firmly. Actions have consequences, Jason. Isn't that what you always told me when I expressed concerns about our spending? That financial choices have real-world impacts? The role reversal was striking. Emma now calmly holding boundaries while Jason scrambled to manipulate the situation. I remained silent, proud of my daughter's composure while recognizing the tremendous effort it must require. I still care about you, Jason said, his voice dropping to the intimate tone that had likely worked effectively in the past. We can work through this together. The Emma I know wouldn't turn her back on 12 years of marriage. The Emma you knew, my daughter replied quietly, was partly a creation of your influence, someone who prioritized appearance over substance, acquisition over meaning. I'm rediscovering who I am without those distortions. Something in her calm certainty seemed to finally penetrate Jason's practiced defenses. He stared at her for a long moment, calculation and genuine emotion battling visibly behind his eyes. You've changed, he said finally. I'm changing back, Emma corrected gently. Back to the person I was meant to be before status and appearances became our shared religion. Jason glanced between us, seeming to recognize that his usual tactics held no power in this new reality. The attorneys will be in touch, he said stiffly, retreating toward his car with what dignity he could muster. We watched in silence as he drove away, the luxury vehicle he could no longer afford disappearing around the corner. Emma released a shaky breath, her composed facade wavering now that he was gone. You handled that beautifully, I said quietly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. It felt like talking to a stranger, she admitted as we walked inside. Someone I recognize but don't really know. I nodded, understanding. Disillusionment is painful, but it's also clarifying. Emma moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the Japanese maple that now blazed crimson in the autumn light. Today was my last day at Glenwood, she said, changing the subject deliberately. I turned in my resignation, cleared out my office, said goodbye to colleagues I've worked with for 8 years. How did that feel? I asked, putting on the kettle for tea, a ritual that had become our shared comfort in recent days. Terrifying, she admitted with a small laugh. And exhilarating. Like jumping off a cliff but knowing there's something better at the bottom than what I left behind. I smiled at the metaphor. That's often how meaningful change feels. Emma turned from the window, her expression more serious. I accessed our joint account today before closing it. There was almost nothing left, less than $1,000 remaining from what should have been substantial savings. Though this confirmed what we had suspected, the concrete reality was still jarring. I'm sorry, Emma. She shook her head, slowly. What hurts isn't the money itself. It's recognizing that while I was planning our future, Jason was systematically dismantling it. All those conversations about retirement goals, travel dreams, even the children we might have someday, they were part of an elaborate performance. The kettle whistled, providing momentary distraction as I prepared our tea. When I handed Emma her cup, chamomile with honey, her preference since childhood, she accepted it with a grateful smile. I've been thinking about something you wrote in the journal, she said, following me to the living room where we settled into our usual spots. About how Grandma Parker responded when their savings were wiped out in that bank failure during the 1980s. I nodded, remembering the story well. She said, "They can take our money, but they can't take our resourcefulness." And then she started that seamstress business from your dining room that eventually funded your college education, Emma continued, creating something meaningful from a financial disaster. Your grandmother was remarkably resilient, I agreed. A quality I see in you, though you might not recognize it yet. Emma sipped her tea thoughtfully. The community center called today. They want me to start Monday instead of next week. Their current programs coordinator is leaving sooner than expected. Do you feel ready? Not entirely, she admitted. But I don't think we're ever completely ready for meaningful change. At some point, you just have to take the leap and build your wings on the way down. I smiled at her reference to one of Robert's favorite quotes. Your father would be proud of you, Emma. Not because you're making choices he would have made, but because you're making choices aligned with authentic values rather than external pressures. She brushed away unexpected tears. I wish he was here to see this transformation, to know that all those lessons he tried to teach me about meaningful wealth finally took root. He knows, I said simply. Perhaps not in ways we can understand, but the wisdom he shared continues to ripple outward through your choices now. The following Monday marked Emma's first day at the community center. She left early, dressed in professional but practical clothing, a world away from the designer suits and statement jewelry that had become her uniform at Glenwood Health Systems. The nervous excitement in her eyes reminded me of her first day of kindergarten, apprehension mixed with anticipation of new possibilities. When Emma returned that evening, her face glowed with an energy I hadn't seen in years. She practically burst through the door, hanging her jacket with uncharacteristic carelessness before joining me in the kitchen where I was preparing dinner. It was amazing, she announced without preamble. Challenging and overwhelming and completely different from corporate healthcare, but absolutely amazing. I smiled, putting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables. Tell me everything. For the next half hour, Emma described her first day with animated detail. The dedicated but overworked staff, the adult learners pursuing GEDs despite tremendous obstacles, the ESL students practicing English while juggling multiple jobs and family responsibilities. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke, a habit from childhood that had gradually disappeared during her years with Jason, and his constant reminders about professional composure. There's this woman, Lucia, Emma continued, accepting the glass of water I handed her. She works full-time cleaning hotel rooms, has 3 children under 10, and still comes to classes 4 nights a week to improve her English. When I asked what motivates her, she said she wants her children to see that education doesn't stop when you're an adult. Remarkable commitment, I observed, resuming dinner preparation as Emma perched on a kitchen stool. That's what struck me throughout the day, she agreed. Everyone there, staff and students alike, is deeply committed despite having every reason to give up. It makes the concerns at my old job seem so trivial by comparison. I nodded, understanding. Different perspectives on what constitutes a genuine problem. Exactly. Emma reached for a carrot from the cutting board, crunching it thoughtfully. At Glenwood, we'd have emergency meetings because the new lobby furniture was delayed or someone was upset about parking assignments. Today, I watched the center director trying to figure out how to stretch the food pantry supplies when requests have doubled in the past month. The contrast clearly affected her deeply. I recognized this as a crucial moment in her evolving consciousness. Direct confrontation with realities so different from the insulated world she had inhabited for years. The technology situation is worse than I realized, she continued. The adult education program is using computers donated over a decade ago. They can barely run basic software, let alone provide the digital literacy training today's job market requires. You mentioned there was a proposal in development? I prompted, sliding chopped vegetables into the waiting pan. Emma nodded eagerly. I spent my lunch break looking over what they've drafted. It's solid conceptually, but needs significant strengthening in terms of outcomes measurement and sustainability planning. That's where my Glenwood experience could actually be useful. Healthcare systems are certainly rigorous about metrics. I agreed, recalling Emma's frequent complaints about the endless reporting requirements in her previous role. I told the director I'd refine the proposal this week, she continued. If we can secure funding for an updated technology lab, it would transform what they can offer to adult learners. Is this something you're considering for the matching trust? I asked casually, though I already suspected the answer. Emma's eyes lit up. Absolutely. It's exactly the kind of impactful project the journal described, addressing immediate needs while building capacity for long-term change. We continued preparing dinner together, falling into a comfortable rhythm that reminded me of earlier years before career advancement and social climbing became Emma's primary focus. As we worked, she asked thoughtful questions about the trust, mechanics, clearly processing how this resource could be leveraged effectively rather than simply consumed. So if I contribute 10 hours of skilled volunteer time on the proposal development, that generates $1,000 for the center. No, she confirmed, setting plates on the table. Correct, I nodded. And if you make personal financial contributions, those are matched 5-1. Emma's brow furrowed in calculation. My first paycheck from the center will be significantly smaller than I'm used to, but I could still commit $500 to launch the technology project, which would generate an additional $2,500 from the trust, I confirmed. She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. It's a powerful model, Mom, encouraging direct involvement rather than passive inheritance. That was precisely the intention, I acknowledged. Your father and I always believed wealth should be a catalyst for engagement, not a substitute for it. After dinner, Emma settled at the dining room table with her laptop, diving into research about technology solutions for adult education programs. I observed quietly from the kitchen as I cleaned up, noting how her approach differed from her work at Glenwood. There, her focus had been efficiency and advancement, completing tasks in ways that would be recognized and rewarded by superiors. Now, she was absorbed in the challenge itself, motivated by potential impact rather than personal recognition. The transformation continued in subtle ways over the subsequent weeks. Emma refined the technology proposal, combining her professional expertise with growing understanding of the center's specific needs. Her personal style evolved as well. Designer labels gradually replaced by simpler, more practical choices that reflected shifting priorities. Meanwhile, Jason's legal situation deteriorated further. The Securities Commission investigation had expanded to include multiple charges of fraud, identity theft, and financial exploitation. Emma received this news with complicated emotions: grief for what might have been, anger at the deception, relief that justice was being pursued. They've offered him a plea agreement, she told me one evening in late October as we walked through the neighborhood enjoying the fall colors. Substantial jail time, financial restitution, cooperation against others involved in similar schemes. Has he accepted? I asked, noting the tension in her shoulders despite her outwardly calm demeanor. His attorney is pushing for it, Emma replied. The evidence is overwhelming, especially now that other victims have come forward. How are you feeling about that? She considered the question carefully, kicking at fallen leaves as we walked. Conflicted. There's a part of me that still struggles to reconcile the man I thought I married with someone capable of such calculated deception. But mostly, I feel... What? I prompted gently when she hesitated. Clarity, she finally said. Like I've awakened from a very long dream where things seemed normal, but were subtly distorted. Now the world is in proper focus again. I nodded understanding, grateful for her self-awareness. That's an insightful way to describe it. The prosecutor wants me to record a formal statement, she continued, about the emotional and psychological impact of this type of betrayal. Apparently, these cases are difficult to prosecute because victims often feel too ashamed or embarrassed to testify. Will you do it? Emma nodded, determination evident in her expression. I think I have to, not just for my own closure, but for others who might be targeted by similar schemes in the future. The following week brought a significant milestone: Emma's first official contribution through the matching trust. The community center's technology proposal had been finalized, with Emma contributing both professional expertise and personal funds to launch the initiative. The director couldn't believe it when I explained how the matching would work, she told me excitedly after presenting the check. They've been trying to fund this technology upgrade for over 2 years, and suddenly it's fully funded plus additional resources for training and support. The pride in her voice had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with meaningful impact, a subtle but profound shift in what she valued and celebrated. November brought another development. Emma was invited to meet with 2 other women who had been targeted by Jason before her. Susan arranged a carefully structured meeting at her office, creating a safe environment for this difficult but potentially healing conversation. "I'm nervous," Emma admitted as I drove her to the appointment. "What if they blame me for not recognizing his patterns sooner? What if I had somehow inadvertently helped him target others?" "From everything we know, you were a victim, not an accomplice," I reminded her gently. "This meeting is about shared healing, not assigning blame." She nodded, though anxiety remained evident in her expression. "It just feels so surreal, meeting others who experience the same manipulation from the same person, like we're all characters in some bizarre psychological thriller. Sometimes shared experience, even painful ones, can be powerfully validating," I suggested, confirming that what happened wasn't your fault or due to some personal deficiency. Emma was quiet for a moment, watching the familiar streets of Oakridge pass by. "You know what's strange? Despite everything, I still find myself occasionally missing aspects of our marriage. Not him specifically, but the certainty I felt about my path, my future. Everything seemed so defined and secure. Even false certainty can feel comforting," I acknowledged. "The human mind often prefers a known negative to an unknown potential positive." When we arrived at Susan's office, I offered to wait in the reception area, but Emma asked me to join the meeting, a request that touched me deeply. Inside, 2 women were already seated in Susan's comfortable conference room. Rachel, a poised woman in her early 40s with an architectural firm according to Susan's introduction, and Diane, slightly older with the confident presence of the corporate executive she was. Initial awkwardness quickly gave way to recognition of shared experience as the women began comparing their relationships with Jason. Despite different backgrounds and professions, the patterns were strikingly similar. The charming introduction, at professional events, whirlwind romance, gradual isolation from questioning friends, subtle undermining of financial confidence, and eventually, systematic exploitation of assets. He had this way of making financial decisions seem collaborative while actually controlling everything, Diane observed, the others nodding in recognition. By the time I realized what was happening, he'd restructured most of my investments into vehicles only he fully understood or could access. And the constant subtle suggestions that we needed to maintain certain appearances, Rachel added. The right address, the right car, the right social connections, all requiring increasingly expensive commitments that coincidentally necessitated liquidating my secured assets. Emma listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions while sharing her own experiences. The conversation had a cathartic quality, each woman validating the other's perceptions while helping complete the puzzle of understanding how they had been manipulated by the same skilled predator. "The hardest part for me wasn't even the financial loss," Diane confessed after they had been talking for over an hour. "It was doubting my own judgment afterward, wondering how I, someone who runs a successful company and manages hundreds of employees, could have been so thoroughly deceived in my personal life." "Professional accomplishment doesn't inoculate us against emotional manipulation," Susan observed gently. "In fact, sometimes achievement-oriented individuals are particularly vulnerable to certain types of influence precisely because they're accustomed to mastery and control." "That resonates," Emma acknowledged. I prided myself on competence and strategic thinking, yet completely missed the signs that should have been obvious. Because he specifically targeted strengths and turned them into vulnerabilities, Rachel pointed out. My attention to detail became unnecessary worry about financial matters. My questions became micromanaging our shared future. The conversation continued for nearly 3 hours, covering not just the manipulation they had experienced, but also their recovery journeys. Both Diane and Rachel had rebuilt their financial security in the years since their relationships with Jason ended, though the emotional recovery had taken longer than the practical reconstruction. Have either of you been able to trust again? Emma asked toward the end of their meeting. In relationships, I mean. The women exchanged glances before Diane responded. Gradually, yes, but it's different now. More measured, more attentive, to subtle signs I previously ignored. I'm in a relationship currently, but we maintain separate finances with very transparent discussions about money. I've chosen to remain single, Rachel said simply. Not because I think all men are predators, but because I've discovered I'm actually happier focusing on my career and close friendships without the complications of romantic partnership. As we prepared to leave, Diane touched Emma's arm gently. The prosecutor mentioned you're considering recording a victim impact statement for the case. Emma nodded. I'm still working through what I want to say, but yes. I recorded mine yesterday, Diane said. It was difficult but surprisingly empowering, naming the harm explicitly while refusing to be defined by it. That's a good way to put it, Emma replied thoughtfully, acknowledging the impact without accepting it as deserved or defining. Outside in the parking lot, Emma was quiet as we walked to the car, clearly processing the intense conversation. When we were seated, but before I started the engine, she turned to me. Thank you for arranging that, she said simply. It was difficult, but clarifying. In what way? I asked, giving her my full attention. Hearing their stories made me understand something important, she replied slowly, choosing her words with care. What happened wasn't just about Jason, or even about the women he targeted. It was about a particular dynamic, skilled predation meeting specific vulnerabilities. I nodded encouragement, seeing her working through important realizations. The similarities in our stories weren't coincidental, Emma continued. He deliberately selected women with similar psychological profiles, accomplished, independently wealthy, somewhat isolated by their success, and vulnerable to certain types of validation. That sounds accurate based on what we know, I agreed. Which means, she concluded, her expression clearing with newfound understanding, that moving forward isn't just about avoiding men like Jason. It's about addressing the specific vulnerabilities that made his approach effective. The insight struck me as remarkably sophisticated, moving beyond simple victim narrative to complex understanding of interactional dynamics. That's an extremely valuable perspective, Emma. She smiled slightly. It feels like reclaiming agency. Not blaming myself for being targeted, but recognizing patterns I can now consciously address. As November progressed toward Thanksgiving, Emma's work at the community center deepened. The technology initiative moved from proposal to implementation, with new computers scheduled for installation during the holiday break. Meanwhile, her apartment above the center was gradually taking shape, a modest space reflecting her evolving priorities rather than status considerations. It's strange, she commented while showing me the nearly completed apartment. A year ago, I would have found this place completely inadequate. Now it feels exactly right for this stage of my life. The space was indeed a dramatic departure from the luxury home she had shared with Jason, perhaps a third of the size, with simple furnishings and practical amenities. Yet it possessed a warmth and authenticity that the showcase house had always lacked. You've made thoughtful choices, I observed, noting how the limited space had been organized around activities that mattered to her: reading, writing, simple cooking. That's the word that keeps coming to mind lately. Thoughtful, Emma agreed. For years, my choices were reflexive rather than reflective, based on assumptions about what success should look like rather than what actually brought fulfillment. The change was evident not just in her living situation, but in daily habits and priorities. Designer labels had been replaced by quality basics. Social media presence had shifted from carefully curated lifestyle images to occasional authentic moments. Time once dedicated to networking events and status signaling activities was now invested in meaningful work and genuine connections. As Thanksgiving approached, Emma surprised me by suggesting we host a dinner at our home for community center clients who had nowhere else to go for the holiday. The center usually provides a meal, she explained, but their kitchen facilities are limited, and the environment is institutional rather than home-like. I thought we might create something more personal for those who would otherwise be alone. The suggestion touched me deeply, not just for its inherent kindness, but for what it revealed about Emma's evolving perspective. That sounds wonderful. How many people are we talking about? Maybe a dozen, she replied. Mostly older adults without family nearby, a few international students, perhaps a couple of the single mothers whose families are in other states. We spent the next week planning and preparing, transforming our traditional family Thanksgiving into a community celebration. Emma approached the project with characteristic thoroughness, but with entirely different motivation than her previous. Entertaining with Jason, focused on comfort and connection rather than impression management. Thanksgiving Day arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and clear with lingering fall colors enhanced by golden sunlight. Our guests, initially somewhat hesitant, quickly warmed to the welcoming atmosphere Emma had carefully cultivated. Lucia, the dedicated ESL student Emma had mentioned her first day, brought homemade tamales as her contribution. Mr. Chen, an elderly Chinese immigrant learning English in retirement, shared stories of holidays in his homeland. Rebecca, a single mother of 3 pursuing her GED, brought her children who delighted in helping arrange centerpieces and place cards. Throughout the meal, I observed Emma with quiet pride. She moved among our guests with genuine interest and attention, asking thoughtful questions, listening actively to their stories, creating connections between people with shared interests or complementary experiences. This wasn't the polished networking she had perfected for Jason's business functions, performative interest designed to advance professional agenda, but authentic engagement with fellow humans whose lives and perspectives she valued. After everyone had departed and we were clearing the final dishes, Emma paused, a stack of plates in her hands. "This was the most meaningful Thanksgiving I can remember," she said softly. Seeing Mr. Chen teaching Rebecca's kids how to use chopsticks, watching Lucia exchange recipes with Mrs. Peterson, it felt like community, I supplied when she hesitated. Genuine connection across differences. Exactly. She resumed, clearing the table, a thoughtful expression on her face. You know, for years I thought I was building something meaningful with Jason, a life of accomplishment and acquisition that would somehow culminate in fulfillment. I waited, sensing she was working through an important realization. But this, she gestured to the remnants of our gathering. This felt immediately meaningful, not as a step toward something else or an investment in future status, but valuable in itself, in the actual moment of experience. I smiled, recognizing the wisdom in her observation. That's an important distinction. The journal you gave me has an entry about this, Emma continued. Dad wrote about the difference between instrumental activities, things we do as means to other ends, versus inherently meaningful experiences that need no further justification. That was a core principle for him, I confirmed, and one that guided many of our major life decisions. Emma nodded slowly. I'm beginning to understand why you structured my inheritance the way you did. It's not about controlling my choices or punishing past mistakes. What is it about? I asked, genuinely curious about her perception. Creating conditions for rediscovering what matters, she replied simply. Reconnecting financial resources with genuine meaning and purpose rather than status or consumption. The insight warmed me deeply. She had understood precisely what Robert and I had hoped to accomplish with the thoughtfully structured trust, not punishment or control, but liberation from patterns that had separated her from authentic fulfillment. Later that evening, after the house was restored to order, Emma joined me in the living room with 2 mugs of herbal tea. Outside, the first light snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the Japanese maple with delicate white powder. "I recorded my victim impact statement yesterday," she said quietly, settling into the armchair across from me. "For Jason's case." "How did that go?" I asked, noting both the resolution and vulnerability in her expression. "It was harder than I expected," she admitted, articulating the psychological and emotional impact of betrayal by someone I had built a life with. "There aren't adequate words for that kind of violation." I nodded understanding, waiting for her to continue at her own pace. "But I also found myself speaking about hope and recovery," she went on. "About discovering that surviving betrayal can actually clarify what matters and reconnect us with deeper values." "That's a profound perspective," I observed, finding meaning within painful experience without minimizing the genuine harm. Emma sipped her tea thoughtfully. The prosecutor said victim statements often focus exclusively on damage and loss. She seemed surprised by my emphasis on rebuilding and reclaiming authentic purpose. "That perspective reflects significant healing," I suggested, not dismissing the harm, but refusing to be permanently defined by it. "I think that's exactly it," Emma agreed. "I'm not just Jason's ex-wife or a fraud victim or someone who lost financial security. Those are experiences I've had, not the totality of who I am." Outside, the snow continued to fall in gentle silence, transforming the familiar landscape into something new yet fundamentally unchanged beneath its temporary covering. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of us as we sat in companionable quiet, watching nature's simple miracle through the window. December brought accelerated developments in Jason's legal situation. His attorneys, recognizing the overwhelming evidence against him, negotiated a plea agreement that included substantial prison time, financial restitution, and cooperation against others involved in similar schemes. "He'll serve at least 5 years," Emma informed me after receiving the update from the prosecutor's office, "and has agreed to full cooperation identifying others in the network." "How do you feel about that resolution?" I asked carefully, aware of the complex emotions involved. "Relieved, mostly," she admitted. "A trial would have been excruciating, not just for me, but for all the women involved, and his cooperation might actually help prevent others from experiencing similar exploitation." The plea agreement included provisions for restitution, though the practical reality was that most of Jason's apparent wealth had been illusory. Leveraged assets, funds belonging to others, appearances maintained through increasingly desperate financial maneuvers. The prosecutor was frank about recovery expectations, Emma explained. "Some assets can be liquidated for victim compensation, but the amounts will be significantly less than what was taken." "And you're at peace with that aspect?" I asked, watching her expression carefully. She considered the question thoughtfully. "Strangely, yes. The financial losses were substantial, but the most valuable recovery has been reclaiming my authentic self and purpose. That's something no restitution payment could provide anyway." The wisdom in her perspective struck me deeply. In the midst of loss and betrayal, Emma had discovered something precious that might have remained buried indefinitely had her comfortable but ultimately hollow life with Jason continued undisrupted. The week before Christmas, Emma officially moved into her apartment above the community center, though she planned to spend the holidays with me. The timing seemed symbolically appropriate, a fresh start as the year drew to a close, a new chapter, beginning as we approached the darkest days that would gradually yield to increasing light. "It feels right," she said as we carried the last few boxes up the narrow staircase to her new home. "Not just practically suitable, but aligned with who I'm becoming." The apartment, though modest, reflected Emma's evolving priorities. Functional without being austere, thoughtfully arranged to support daily activities that brought genuine satisfaction rather than status. Bookshelves held volumes on education, community development, and social change alongside a few cherished novels. A simple desk positioned near the window overlooked the community garden, now dormant under winter snow, but promising renewal in spring. "I'm planning a small gathering after New Year's," Emma mentioned as we arranged the final items. "Nothing. Elaborate. Just a few colleagues from the center and people I've connected with recently. Would you join us?" "I'd be honored," I replied, touched by the invitation. For years, Emma's entertaining had been exclusively focused on Jason's business connections and social climbing opportunities. This represented something entirely different, authentic community building rather than strategic networking. As Christmas approached, I noticed Emma spending evenings at her laptop, occasionally printing documents that she carefully filed in a dedicated folder. When I inquired casually, she smiled mysteriously. "Just working on something special," she said. "You'll see on Christmas morning." The holiday itself was quietly meaningful. We attended the candlelight service at our community church on Christmas Eve, a tradition from Emma's childhood that she had gradually abandoned during her years with Jason, as social obligations took precedence over spiritual reflection. Christmas morning brought a simple exchange of thoughtful gifts, including the mysterious folder Emma had been preparing. "This is for you," she said, handing me the carefully bound collection of documents. "It's not quite finished, but I wanted you to see the direction." Opening the folder, I discovered what appeared to be a grant proposal, professionally formatted, meticulously researched, with detailed budgets and implementation timelines. The title page read, "The Robert Wilson Legacy Project, Intergenerational Mentorship for Educational Equity." "What is this?" I asked, genuinely surprised as I began scanning the executive summary. Emma's eyes shone with quiet excitement. "It's an extension of Dad's scholarship foundation. Instead of just providing financial support to first-generation college students, this program would create a mentorship network connecting scholarship recipients with professionals in their fields of interest." I continued reading, impressed by the thoughtful design and comprehensive approach. The proposal outlined a multi-year implementation plan, leveraging partnerships with local businesses, educational institutions, and community organizations. "This is remarkable, Emma," I said sincerely. "The integration of financial support? With relationship-based mentoring addresses the invisible barriers many first-generation students face beyond just paying for classes." She nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Research shows that first-generation students often struggle not just with tuition costs, but with navigating unwritten expectations, building professional networks, and accessing opportunities that students from college-educated families take for granted." "Where would funding come from?" I asked, noticing the substantial budget projections. "That's where I was hoping for your guidance," Emma admitted. "I've identified several potential funding sources, including local foundations and corporate giving programs, and I thought perhaps some of my matching trust might be directed toward launch costs once I've secured external partners." The strategic thinking impressed me as much as the program concept itself. This wasn't a request for me to fund her idea, but a thoughtful proposal for collaborative resource development, approaching philanthropic impact with the same rigor she had once applied to corporate healthcare administration. "I'd be delighted to help develop this further," I assured her. "The concept aligns beautifully with your father's values and extends the foundation's impact in meaningful ways." Emma's expression softened. "That's what I hoped. A way to honor Dad's legacy, while creating something that addresses needs, he would have recognized as important. As I continued reviewing the proposal, something profound struck me about this moment. The daughter who had once demanded access to my retirement funds now sat before me presenting a sophisticated plan to leverage shared resources for community benefit. The transformation wasn't just in specific choices or priorities, but in fundamental orientation toward wealth and purpose. "You know," I said quietly, setting down the proposal, "this is exactly what your father and I always hoped for." "The mentorship program?" Emma asked, slightly confused. "Your reconnection with purpose-driven work," I clarified. "Not following our specific path, but finding your own authentic way to create meaningful impact." Emma's eyes glistened slightly. "It feels like coming home to myself in some ways, like remembering who I was always meant to be beneath the layers of achievement-oriented identity I constructed." "That's a beautiful way to express it," I acknowledged, "coming home to yourself." Outside, fresh. Snow had begun falling again, coating the Japanese maple in crystalline white. The tree Robert had planted on our 25th anniversary stood as silent witness to cycles of growth, loss, and renewal. Branches bare now, but holding the promise of springtime transformation, just as Emma's life contained seeds of purpose, beginning to blossom after a difficult winter season. As we sat together on Christmas morning, the modest gifts exchanged between us seemed perfect symbols of our evolving relationship. Thoughtful rather than extravagant, meaningful rather than impressive, chosen with genuine consideration rather than obligation or display. Emma's proposal represented something far more valuable than any material inheritance I could have provided: the transmission of values that would continue creating positive impact long after financial resources might be exhausted. "Merry Christmas, Mom," Emma said softly, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I lost my way." "That's what love does," I replied simply. "It holds space for who we truly are, even when we've temporarily forgotten." The snow continued falling outside our window, each unique, crystalline flake contributing to the quiet transformation of the winter landscape, nature's reminder that renewal often begins invisibly, beneath the surface, preparing for springtime revelation of what has been quietly developing all along. Winter melted into spring, nature's timeless cycle of renewal echoing the transformation unfolding in Emma's life. The mentorship program she had proposed at Christmas had moved from concept to reality with remarkable speed, fueled by her natural, organizational talents now directed toward meaningful impact rather than corporate advancement. The first cohort of mentors completed their training yesterday, Emma announced one April evening as we shared dinner at my home, a weekly tradition we had maintained despite her move to the apartment above the community center. 12 professionals from diverse fields, all committed to supporting first-generation college students. "That's wonderful progress," I remarked, genuinely impressed by how quickly she had implemented the complex program. "How soon will they begin working with scholars?" "Next month," Emma replied, her expression lighting with the quiet enthusiasm that had replaced her former calculated ambition. "We've matched each mentor with 2 students based on career interests and personal background. The Foundation's summer orientation session will include their first formal meeting, though several mentors have already reached out to their students informally." I smiled, remembering how Robert had always emphasized the importance of personal connection in educational success. "Your father would be so pleased with this extension of his vision." "I hope so," Emma said softly. "I keep finding his influence in unexpected places as I work with these students. His belief that education isn't just about information transfer, but about transformation of possibilities." The Robert Wilson Legacy Project had indeed become a fitting tribute to my late husband's values, combining financial support with the relational mentoring he had always believed essential for true educational equity. Through Emma's skilled leadership, The project had secured additional funding from local businesses and philanthropic organizations, expanding its reach beyond what the foundation alone could have accomplished. The Westridge Foundation approved our matching grant yesterday, Emma continued, referring to a major regional philanthropic organization. That's the third external funder to come on board. Combined with the trust matching, we'll be able to serve twice as many students as originally projected. Your proposal development skills are clearly transferable from healthcare, I observed, proud of how she had leveraged her professional expertise toward this new purpose. Emma nodded thoughtfully. The technical skills translated easily enough, but the motivation is entirely different. At Glenwood, I developed proposals primarily to advance my career and impress superiors. Now, the work itself provides the satisfaction. This fundamental shift in orientation, from external validation to intrinsic meaning, characterized all aspects of Emma's evolving life. Her wardrobe, once filled with status-signaling designer labels, now consisted of quality basics selected for versatility and appropriateness to her community-based work. Her social circle had transformed from Jason's calculated networking connections to authentic relationships with colleagues, neighbors, and community members. Even her conversation had changed, focusing on ideas and impact rather than acquisitions and appearances. "Have you heard anything more about Jason's case?" I asked carefully, aware that despite her remarkable healing, discussion of her ex-husband remained sensitive territory. "The sentencing is scheduled for next week," Emma replied, her expression composed though tinged with sadness. His cooperation apparently provided significant evidence against others in the network. The prosecutor says at least 3 additional indictments have resulted from his testimony. "Will you attend the sentencing?" Emma shook her head decisively. "No, I've provided my victim impact statement, and the prosecutor will represent my interests. Being physically present would feel like remaining tethered to that chapter of my life. I'm ready to focus forward completely." The wisdom in her approach struck me. This wasn't denial or avoidance, but healthy boundary setting, acknowledging what had happened while refusing to allow it to dominate her present or future. "Rachel called yesterday," Emma added, referring to one of the other women Jason had targeted before her. "She's launching a public awareness campaign about romance-based financial fraud. She asked if I might consider sharing my experience as part of their educational materials." "How do you feel about that possibility?" I asked, noting the thoughtful consideration in her expression. "Cautiously positive," Emma replied. "If my story could help others recognize warning signs or validate their experiences, that would transform something painful into something constructive. This perspective, finding meaning by converting personal difficulty into benefit for others, represented another significant evolution in Emma's worldview. The self-focused achievement orientation that had characterized her years with Jason had been replaced by genuine concern for community welfare and collective benefit. May arrived with bursting tulips and delicate apple blossoms, nature's exuberant celebration of renewal. The community center's garden, dormant through winter months, now hummed with activity as staff and volunteers prepared beds for summer vegetables and flowering plants. Emma had taken particular interest in this project, recognizing its multiple benefits for community members: fresh produce for the food pantry, therapeutic activity for seniors, educational opportunities for children. "We're introducing a youth entrepreneurship component this summer," she explained one Saturday morning as we worked together turning compost into a newly expanded section. "The teenagers will manage their own market garden plot, learning agricultural skills alongside business basics like budgeting, marketing, and customer service." I smiled, remembering a similar project Robert had championed decades earlier at his school. "Your father implemented something like that with his middle school students. They called it the Growing Business Program." "That's where I got the idea," Emma confessed with a gentle smile. "I found his curriculum notes in that box of teaching materials you saved. His approach was remarkably sophisticated, integrating math, science, and business concepts through practical application. The discovery touched me deeply, Robert's influence continuing to ripple outward through our daughter's work years after his passing. This transmission of values, rather than mere wealth, had always been our deepest hope for Emma's inheritance. The trust matching has been approved for the youth program, Emma continued, referring to the mechanism we had established to amplify her community contributions. $5,000 from program funds plus my personal donation of $500, matched 5-to-1 by the trust. That's wonderful, I replied, genuinely pleased by how effectively she was utilizing the structure we had created. Exactly how your father and I envisioned the trust functioning. Emma paused in her gardening, wiping perspiration from her brow with a gloved hand. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. How differently I view this inheritance structure now compared to when you first explained it. How so? I asked, curious about her perspective. Initially, I saw it as restriction, limiting my access to resources I believed I was entitled to receive directly, she admitted candidly. Now I understand it as liberation, creating a framework that connects financial resources with meaningful purpose rather than mere consumption. The insight demonstrated how profoundly her understanding had evolved. What had once seemed like punishment or control was now recognized as thoughtful design intended to foster precisely the reconnection with authentic values that had ultimately occurred. The journal you gave me has an entry about this exact concept, Emma continued, referencing the legacy document I had prepared during the difficult period before confronting her and Jason. Dad wrote about the difference between wealth as possession versus wealth as possibility. How money's greatest value lies not in what it allows us to accumulate, but in what it enables us to activate. That was central to his philosophy, I acknowledged, and increasingly to mine after his passing, as I considered how best to honor our shared values through the foundation and trust structures. As spring yielded to early summer, Emma's life continued its positive trajectory. The community center promoted her to associate director, recognizing her exceptional contributions to program development and resource expansion. The mentorship program welcomed its first formal cohort of students, the youth entrepreneurship garden flourished, and the technology center Emma had helped establish became a vital community resource. In June, Emma invited me to attend a small gathering at her apartment to celebrate these collective achievements. The modest space had evolved over months to reflect her authentic self, walls adorned with local artists' work rather than expensive decor, bookshelves filled with volumes on education and community development, simple but comfortable furnishings selected for function rather than status. The guests represented Emma's reconstructed social circle, colleagues from the center, mentors from the foundation program, neighbors from the surrounding community. Their conversation focused on ideas and impact rather than possessions or prestige, creating an atmosphere of genuine connection I hadn't experienced in Emma's social gatherings for many years. Your daughter is remarkable, commented Maria, the community center's director, as we enjoyed refreshments on Emma's small balcony, overlooking the garden below. She's transformed our programs and resource development in less than a year. She's always had extraordinary organizational talents, I acknowledged. I'm simply grateful she's applying them to work that aligns with her deeper values. Maria nodded understanding. She mentioned her previous career and the significant life changes that brought her to us. It takes courage to completely reimagine your life path, especially after achieving conventional success. True transformation often requires disruption, I observed, though I would have wished for gentler catalysts than what Emma experienced. Inside, Emma was engaged in animated conversation with a small group discussing expanding the mentorship program to include community college students. Her expression reflected genuine engagement. The polished professional smile she had perfected for Jason's networking events replaced by authentic enthusiasm for meaningful possibilities. Later that evening, after guests had departed, Emma and I sat on her small balcony enjoying the lingering summer twilight. Below us, the community garden remained visible in fading light, neat rows of emerging vegetables promising future harvests to be shared among neighbors and food pantry clients. "I received the final paperwork from the divorce attorney today," Emma said quietly, breaking our companionable silence. "Everything is officially completed." I reached over to squeeze her hand gently. "How are you feeling about that closure?" She considered the question thoughtfully, her gaze following the flight path of a bird returning to its nest in nearby trees. Relieved, mostly, though there's still a certain sadness for what might have been if the relationship had been built on truth rather than calculation. I nodded understanding, allowing space for her complex emotions. "The financial resolution was far less than expected, of course," Emma continued pragmatically. "Jason's assets were largely illusions, and what remained has gone primarily to restitution for earlier victims." "Are you comfortable with your financial situation?" I asked, aware that her current position represented a fraction of her previous income. Emma smiled, genuine contentment evident in her expression. "More than comfortable. I'm earning less, certainly, but I'm also spending differently, investing in experiences and relationships that create lasting satisfaction rather than temporary status." The wisdom in her perspective struck me deeply. Without financial catastrophe as catalyst, she might never have discovered the liberation available through simpler living aligned with authentic values. "The trust matching has been transformative for my ability to contribute meaningfully despite reduced personal resources," Emma acknowledged. "That structure you and Dad created, which I once resented as controlling, has actually expanded my impact far beyond what would have been possible otherwise." "That was always our intent," I confirmed. "Not limiting your choices, but amplifying those aligned with genuine purpose." As darkness settled over the community garden below, fireflies began their evening dance among the vegetable rows. Nature's reminder that even the smallest lights can transform darkness when their purpose remains clear and consistent. "I found something when organizing Dad's teaching materials," Emma said, reaching inside to retrieve a small box from nearby shelves. "I thought you might want to have it back." She handed me a weathered leather case I immediately recognized. Robert's first pocket watch, given to him by his grandfather when he earned his teaching credential. Inside, the inscription remained clearly legible despite decades of wear. "Time spent in service to others is never wasted." "He carried this every day for so many years," I said softly, emotion catching in my throat. "Where did you find it?" "It was tucked inside his lesson planning book for that growing business program," Emma explained, with a note saying he planned to give it to me when I discovered my own form of meaningful service. The thoughtfulness of Robert's intention, preserved across years and discovered precisely when Emma had indeed found her authentic path of contribution, seemed almost mysteriously appropriate. "He would be so proud of who you've become," I said, carefully returning the watch to its case. "Not because you've followed his specific choices, but because you've reconnected with the values that infuse them." Emma's eyes glistened in the fading light. "That means everything to me." We sat in companionable silence as full darkness descended, the community garden below now visible only in outline. From neighboring apartments came the gentle sounds of families concluding their day, dishes being washed, children's laughter, occasional music drifting through open windows. Simple, ordinary moments that collectively formed the meaningful texture of authentic community life. "I've been thinking," Emma said finally, her voice thoughtful in the darkness, "about what really happens when we leave something to someone else." "What conclusions have you reached?" I asked, hearing the reflective depth in her tone. "That the most valuable inheritances aren't financial assets, but the values that guide their use," she replied. You and Dad couldn't simply transfer your wisdom and perspective to me directly. I had to discover their truth through my own journey, even when that path included painful detours. The insight demonstrated remarkable self-awareness and acceptance of her complex journey. That's profound, Emma. When I demanded your retirement fund, she continued, I was seeking something I already possessed without recognizing its value, the capacity to create meaning through purposeful engagement rather than acquisition or status. I smiled in the darkness, deeply moved by her understanding. And that, my dear, is why you froze when you saw what I'd actually left you. It wasn't what you expected, but ultimately proved to be what you most needed. Emma reached for my hand, squeezing it gently in wordless understanding as fireflies continued their illuminating dance in the garden below, each small light contributing to the transformation of darkness into something beautiful and alive with possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.